New president, yes. So take two. I'm especially delighted to welcome today's speaker, Lieutenant Commander Dairmid Gunn, OBE. In 1949, Dairmid entered the Royal Naval College, Dartmouth, 1949, as an executive officer, cadet, and on graduating spent 20 years in the fleet. He saw active service in Korea and the Mediterranean, Port Said and Cyprus, that is, and studied Russian for 2 years at London University and in Paris. In the 1960s, he served as a naval attaché in the British embassies in Moscow and Helsinki. After leaving the Navy in 1973, Dairmid became the director of an organisation which endeavoured to improve the commercial lot of Scottish farmers and the in the UK and the European Union. In 1988, he acted as the coordinator in Scotland for a UK campaign for the promotion of British food and farming. For this, in 1989, he was awarded the OBE. In 1980, he became chairman of the Scottish branch of the GB USSR Association, a non-political body with the aim of improving relations between the Soviet Union and the UK. After the collapse of the USSR in 1991, he became chairman of the Scotland-Russia Forum, a charitable organisation, the aim of which was to improve understanding between Russia and Scotland by cultural means. He is currently a vice president of the forum. In 2017, he co-authored a book on Russian convoys, and in 2018 he was awarded the Pushkin Medal by the Russian government for his work over many years in improving understanding between Russia and the UK. Dairmid is the literary executor of the estate of the late Neil Gunn and has written many articles and books on the life and work of the author. He is the author's nephew, and I say with permission that he is a veritable son of the gun, both in naval and literary terms. In 1988, Dairmid joined our club and was its chairman between 2000 and 2004. He has given many papers on Scott, usually but not exclusively on the author's connection with Russia. His present paper is on the subject of Sir Walter Scott, Impressions of Russia, and rather than concerning Scott's influence on Russian literature, we'll focus this time on the influence which Russian literature had on Scott's own work. Dairmid.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. In previous talks on Walter Scott and Russia, I approached the subject through Russian eyes. Such questions as how were the works of Scott received in Russia, what impact did Scott's writing have on Russian thought and literature, and how did the Russians perceive Scott as a man, poet, and novelist. In view of Scott's astonishing popularity in the cultural circles of Russian society, this was not for me a daunting task. I would point out that the novels read by the Russians were in French translation, and there was never any doubt among Russian readers that the great unknown, the sobriquet with which Scott was known in Britain, was Walter Scott. As opposed to this approach to Scott and Russia, the matter of Scott's perception of Russia and Russians presented itself as a formidable task. Born in 1771, Scott reached maturity in what can only be described as a turbulent period in European history, and indeed world history, if Britain's loss of the American colonies is taken into account. The European scene was dominated by the political and social upheaval of the French Revolution, the ripples from which threatened the very fabric and stability of France's neighbours on the continent and further afield. The revolutionary armies seemed invincible. Britain was never more thankful for the English Channel separating it from the continent and for a strong and resourceful navy. The Treaty of Amiens in 1802 provided a brief respite from the continual threat of invasion, but the threat from France remained, and was enhanced in 1804 by the coronation in Notre Dame of the ambitious Corsican officer Napoleon Bonaparte as Emperor of France. From 1804 to 1815, France was the dominant country in Europe, and against it, coalitions of its neighbours were formed to keep French ambitions in check. Britain, although protected by the sea and a strong fleet, was nevertheless aware of a possible French invasion from the sea. The Scottish Admiral Duncan's defeat of the revolutionary Dutch fleet at the Battle of Camperdown in 1797 had made invasion less likely, but the menace was always there. Scott himself, although lame from an attack of polio in his childhood, volunteered for service in the local cavalry militia, which sported the grand name of the Royal Edinburgh Light Dragoons. Such a regiment was important for national defence because of its ability to move quickly to trouble spots far from Edinburgh. It was also used during Scott's service to quell local riots, an unpleasant task for the army at any time. In this context, the skirmishes with the rioters at Cross Causeway and Morden Hill come to mind and will be alluded to later. Because of his physical infirmity, Scott had to accept the mundane but important role of quartermaster for the regiment. He had to ensure that the soldiers were constantly supplied and fed. The role allotted to him did not detract in any way from his enthusiasm for the army, its drills, manoeuvres, its campfire gatherings, and the wonderful camaraderie among those with whom he served. In particular, he loved the songs with a distinctive military and cavalry flavour, to which he added some of his own creations. Let me quote a fragment of a ballad he may have recited at a campfire, or encouraged others to sing or recite. March, march, Eskdale and Teviotdale, all the blue bonnets are bound for the border. Trumpets are sounding, war steeds are bounding, stand to your arms and march in good order. This feel for cavalry life was to stand him in good stead when later in life he corresponded with a well-known Russian cavalry officer with the same musical tastes and a flair for poetry. Scott's interest in the army did not interfere too much with his legal career. His progress from his father's legal practice in Edinburgh, in this period, his appointments as Sheriff Deputy of Selkirk and Clerk to the Court of Session had guaranteed him a steady income and the time to indulge other interests. He's already put to good use his knowledge of German with translations of German Romantic poetry. His foray into the field of words also included his interest in local history and the ballads of his native borders. Part of his childhood in the borders had not gone wasted. This was to lead to his publication of the Minstrelsy of the Scottish Borders in 1803 and the Lay of Last Minstrel in 1805, to be followed by the great epic narrative poems of Marmion in 1807 and The Lady of the Lake in 1810. The continental background for these writings was 1805, the defeat of the Russians and Austrians at the Battle of Austerlitz, wonderfully described later in the century in Tolstoy's War and Peace. 1806, the defeat of the Prussians at Enna, and in 1807, the Treaty of Tilsit between Russia and France, signed on a raft on the River Neman in the northeast of Prussia, leading to the strengthening of the Continental Blockade, a hostile measure which prevented British merchant ships from using continental ports for trade. This meant that from 1807 a state of war existed between Russia and Britain. Although Russia didn't observe the blockade carefully, there were occasional skirmishes between the Russian fleet and that of Britain and its ally Sweden. This untidy state of affairs came to an end in 1812, when Napoleon invaded Russia, an invasion that was to end with his retreat from Moscow and his final defeat and abdication in 1814. Although he made attempted comeback in 1815, the 100 Days, he was finally defeated by the British under the Duke of Wellington at Waterloo and banished to the British island possession of St. Helena. Strangely enough, it was the victory at Waterloo that gave Scott his first chance to visit the continent and to meet, among other nationalities, the Russians. His first stop was the battlefield of Waterloo, where he indulged his passion for collecting military memorabilia. He eagerly acquired buttons, eagles, a sword and carbine for his so-called museum. Then on to Paris. The French capital had become the hub for both the political and social meetings. Monarchs, politicians, generals, and members of high society mixed freely. If Scott had been searching for literati from Russia, he would have been disappointed. He was able to meet the American writer Fenimore Cooper and discuss the latest works by Goethe with his more enlightened foreign colleagues. But what of the Russian intelligentsia? Alexander Pushkin, Russia's greatest poet and author of the revered novel in verse, Eugene Onegin, was a 16-year-old youth at the time of the celebrations, albeit a very precocious one. Great Russian language poets such as Derzhavin and Zhukovsky were little known outside Russia. The writer, playwright and historian Nikolai Karamzin, who moved in court circles, would have been the ideal companion for Scott. But alas, a meeting between the two did not take place. For Russian writers themselves, there was a problem in the absence of a language for creative work. French was the court language. Russian for everyday use, and Church Slavonic for the Orthodox Church. Thanks to the work of the polymath Mikhail Lomonosov in the 18th century, an enriched Russian language was born through the fusion of everyday Russian and Church Slavonic. But the Russians had to wait until a mature Pushkin had arrived on the literary scene to appreciate the immense potential of this newly fashioned language. Pushkin wrote essentially in the 1820s and 1830s and was an avid reader of Scott in French translation. The translation of Scott's novels had been the work of a French author and philologist based in London, Auguste de Faucomplay, aided by his son. Scott started high on the social scene with a meeting with Tsar Alexander I, it's portrayed on the screen, at a dinner given by the Earl of Cathcart, the British ambassador to the Russian imperial court in St. Petersburg. For the occasion, he was attired in the blue and red dress of the Circleshire Lieutenancy. For the occasion, the Tsar, noting Scott's lameness, asked where he had sustained the wound during the war. Scott was taken aback, but totally truthful in his reply, and referred to his illness as a child as the cause of his lameness. The Tsar's second question was more difficult to answer, as he sought information on Scott's military service and in what regiment he had served. "Oh yes," said Scott, "I served in the Yeomanry Cavalry." "Under whose command?" asked the Tsar. "Sous Monsieur le Chevalier," repeated Scott in his best French. "Were you ever engaged?" was the next question. "Yes, in some night actions, such as the Battle of Cross Causeway and the affair at Morden Hill." At this juncture, Lord Cathcart thought that the friendly interrogation had gone far enough, and politely moved his imperial guest on to meet other dignitaries. Scott's encounters with Russians at dinner did not end after his meeting with the Tsar. At table, he found himself opposite a Count Matvey Platov, leader of the Don Cossacks, who had participated valiantly in the Battle of Leipzig in October 1813. General Platov's language skills were extremely limited, and the conversation with Scott, interrupted frequently by toast, proceeded with the help of the other guests. The Russian's friendly attitude left Scott in no doubt that his interlocutor was familiar, at least in a limited way, with some of his work. What Platov knew about Scott had to be based on hearsay over some snippets of verse from Scott's minstrelsy of the Scottish borders. This happy encounter at the dinner table was to extend to the following day, when Scott was walking with a friend on the Rue de la Paix. A couple of horsemen came trotting up to the pair and dismounted in front of them. They were no other than Count Platov and his ADC, who was to be the Count's interpreter. After a friendly hug, the Count was quick to come to the point by issuing an invitation to Scott to join his staff at the next great review of the Russian troops. A suitable horse would be put at his disposal. But a shortage of time and other engagements forced Scott to decline this unexpected and exciting invitation. He did so with regret, as he had been impressed by the appearance and demeanour of the Russian troops encountered during his visit, both cavalry and infantry alike. In the life of Sir Walter Scott, Scott's biographer Lockhart was to write that the two foreigners who showed most interest in Scott during his time in Paris were the Prussian commander-in-chief Blücher and the Russian general Matvey Platov. In 1816, the year after Scott's visit to France, Russia was to come to him. A Scottish artist, William Allen, had just returned from several years painting in the Russian Empire. He had used the Scottish contacts, including Alexander Crichton, the physician to the Russian imperial family, to facilitate his journey to the south of Russia. There he became acquainted with Ukraine and the northern part of the Caucasus, that narrow stretch of mountainous land between the Black Sea and the landlocked Caspian Sea. He had acquired a more than working knowledge of Russian to help him to travel and understand the morals and the customs of the native inhabitants, albeit with the help of Russian officials. The subject of some of the oils he painted there were exotic and perhaps too unusual to satisfy the more prosaic tastes of the end reviewers of 1815. Such a picture as that of a Caucasian chief selling slaves to the Turkish Pasha evoked the remark from Scott, a beautiful and poetical picture. The subject would not have been poetical for all the viewers, as the Caucasian girls, renowned for their beauty, were being sold to the Turks for the concubine trade. Like many of the cultured people in his circle, Scott liked Allen's craftsmanship, but did not buy his pictures. He did try, however, to help the painter by organizing a raffle and one of his pictures to raise some money for the artist. Such encouragement helped Allen to survive and use his undoubted talent to focus his attention more on British historical scenes. But there was a buyer for some of the Russian paintings displayed in Edinburgh, and he was no other than the Grand Duke Nicholas of Russia, who was paying an official visit to Scotland in 1816. Scott would probably have been at the civic dinner in Edinburgh, held in honour of the Russian nobleman, and almost undoubtedly been the author of the panegyric read out on occasion in honour of the Duke's brother, Tsar Alexander I. No one at that time could have guessed that the Grand Duke would become the Tsar of Russia, as he was not the immediate heir in the line of succession. In Lockhart's biography of Scott, there is no mention of Scott having a one-to-one meeting with the Grand Duke Perhaps Scott thought that the meeting with his elder brother, Alexander I in Paris, had been enough. For Scott's next encounter with Russia, one must move to the year 1825. Scott was at his beloved Abbotsford, trying to come to terms with the financial problems that had beset him. Interest in him as a poet and likely author, and his reputation for company and hospitality continued to bring in many visitors, some exciting, others boring. In November of that year, Lockhart describes the appearance of a youthful visitor who was to interest Scott and become a welcome visitor over the few years of their acquaintanceship. Under the rubric of a foreigner of a different caste, there is this. There was lately at Abbotsford, and is here for education just now, a young Count Vladimir Davidov. He is nephew of the famous Orlovs. He is quite surprising how much sense and sound thinking this youth has at the early age of 16, without the least self-conceit or forwardness. On the contrary, he seems kind and ingenuous to questions of which people of twice his years would find difficult to answer. I am sorry if the saying were verified in him, so wise, so young, they say, do ne'er live long. It was not verified, and the young man lived on a long and successful life. The young Russian, accompanied by a tutor, had been sent to Edinburgh University to study law. Vladimir Davidov was not the first Russian to be wooed by Edinburgh University. Some years earlier, in the reign of Catherine the Great, a certain Princess Dashkova, an agitator for feminine emancipation, and an extremely cultured lady, had her son enrolled as a student at the Edinburgh University, a department closely allied to the University of Edinburgh now bears the good lady's name. The young Vladimir Davidov could not have guessed that his introduction to Scott was on the eve of an important event in Russian history, which took the shape of an aristocratic attempted coup d'etat in December 1825. Because of the month of the insurrection, the participants earned themselves the name of Decembrists. The majority of them had been young officers who had been to France in the occupying forces of 1814 and 1815, had mixed with the French and other nationalities, and had realized how backward their own country was in political terms. On their agenda of secret meetings in Russia before the attempted coup was the finding of ways to establish a more democratic form of government. At one end of the scale was the formation of a republic. At the other was the adoption of a constitutional monarchy, on the lines of that which obtained in Britain. Also on the agenda was the timing of the coup, and here fate took a hand. In 1825, Alexander I died, and the succession to the throne at first seemed simple. Constantine, Alexander's immediate younger brother, was the obvious successor. He was governor of Poland and had a Polish wife. In correspondence that had preceded Alexander's death, Constantine had made it clear that he didn't wish to be crowned Tsar and preferred to remain governor of Poland. Nicholas, Constantine's younger brother, was in no doubt of his desire to become Tsar and duly ascended the throne. There was some confusion and discontent in the country, and the Decembrists decided to act during a parade to mark the accession of Nicholas I. They thought wrongly, as it turned out, that they had sufficient support in their army to act. The coup was badly organized and totally suppressed. Some of the conspirators were executed, others sentenced to hard labour in Siberia. In many aristocratic families, including the Davidov clan, there were differences of opinion on the justification for the attempted coup. One of Vladimir Davidov's uncles, Vasily, a Decembrist, became a legendary figure in Russian history for his work on the creation of schools and hospitals for the exiled Decembrists and the indigenous peoples of Siberia. It should be noted that many of the wives of the Decembrists chose to join their husbands in exile, brought up children there, and helped to form educated and enlightened communities in that area of Russia so far from their former homes in Moscow and St. Petersburg and their estates in European Russia. Vasily was a legendary figure and the author of, and the subject of many books. Another Davidov uncle, as famous as Vasily, Denis Davidov, Denis Davidov, Denis was not considered by the Russians to be, I beg your pardon, another Davidov was as famous as Vasily. Denis Davidov continued to pursue his military career in the service of the Tsar. He was the epitome of a swashbuckling cavalry officer with all the virtues and vices associated with that image. He led from the front, drank, womanized, wrote poems and songs, memoirs, and even books on military tactics. Although the creative virtues and misdemeanors of the Russian warrior interested Scott, he was more intrigued by the Russians' military exploits at the head of a partisan regiment during Napoleon's retreat from Moscow. Exploits that earned him the Russian the sobriquet of the Black Captain. A letter written by Scott to the captain showed Scott's unqualified admiration for him and all successful military men. His efforts to secure some anecdotes from the Russian were unsuccessful. If they had been, the literary world could have been enriched by stories of the Cossacks and their gallant commander. Denis Davidov was not considered by Russians to be a great poet, but rather one whose verse reflected the exuberance and enthusiasm of a life in the saddle. Alexander Pushkin, Russia's greatest poet, regarded the Black Captain's work as important in the development of a certain type of Russian verse. And Leo Tolstoy, in War and Peace, created a character called Denisov, or Denis, who paid court to the principal heroine, the young and vital Natasha Rostova. But let me leave the Davidov clan for a brief description of Scott's second visit to Paris, a visit prompted by his need to earn money, to pay off his creditors, and ease his financial problems. He had laid much hope on the popularity of his most recent book, Woodstock, and the possibility of success with a book he was writing on the life of Napoleon. A visit to Paris was called for. For this mission, he was accompanied by his younger daughter, Anne. His reputation as a writer was considerably higher in 1826 than it had been in 1815, and he had no difficulty in obtaining access to the Bibliothèque Nationale of Paris. Although still referred to as great and known in Scotland, the French and other continentals were no doubt about the authorships of the novels. The translation of French, the lingua franca of the cultured classes on the continent, had long credited the authorship to Scott. His visit to Paris did not go unnoticed by a certain Russian noble lady, Princess Galitzina, who made a rendezvous with Scott in Paris, at which a covey of young Russian princesses, clad in tartan, danced for him. A Waverley costume ball was given in his honour, and a stage version of Ivanhoe was being performed to back theatres. Young Russian ladies chirruped to him, "Oh, la prison d'Edinburgh" and "La fiancée de la Mamour," and Princess Galitzina claimed that she would have gone to the ends of the earth to meet Scott. Scott dismissed all this as tomfoolery, but nevertheless appreciated the compliments. It was an expression of his popularity at a time when his fortunes in Scotland were at a low ebb. But the society lady had other uses. Her list of acquaintances included a distinguished army officer, General Yermolov. An introduction was made, but Scott had to await his return to Scotland before the promised meeting could take place. If I can find it. Could take place. The general was a seasoned military man, a terrorist, who had fought in many engagements with against Napoleon's armies. Scott's endeavours in researching for the life of Napoleon had given a sound knowledge on the Russian campaign, sufficient to prevent him from being overawed by the formidable general. He posed two important questions about the campaign. The first concerned the cause of the fire which had engulfed Moscow in 1812, and the second concerned the delay by the Russian commander-in-chief Mikhail Kutuzov to expedite his attack on the retreating French forces after Napoleon's decision to withdraw from Moscow. Sadly for Scott, the Russians' answers were vague, if not evasive, and no great help in improving the accuracy of Scott's history associated with the life of Napoleon. Perhaps, as so often happens, Yermolov had been too close to the activity to have had a clear idea of the wider issues. He certainly was a man of action. He was destined to go to the Caucasus to suppress local tribal insurgents and conduct a war against Iran. He was confident about his claim that Russian forces there were unnecessary, as his name was a sufficient guarantee for terrorizing the insurgents and enemies and establishing peace in the region. Maybe President Trump would like to have this man on his staff. In his history, Scott was more complimentary about the Russian conduct of the war against Napoleon in terms of both defense and attack. It must be kept in mind that the book was a history book and not a novel based on history. It lacks the animation of Tolstoy's descriptions of the battles of Austerlitz and Borodino in that great Russian writer's War and Peace. But this was not quite how the great German writer Goethe saw it. To him, the great charm and value of Scott's life of Napoleon seemed quite independent of the question of its accuracy as to small details. That he turned to the book not to find dates sifted and countermarches analysed, but to contemplate what could not but be the broad impressions made on the mind of Scott by the marvellous revolution of his own time in their progress. That he should have been among the first civilians who hurried over to see the battlefield of Waterloo and hear English bugles sound from the walls of Paris could have surprised none who knew the lively concern Scott had always taken in the military efforts of his countrymen. In the Napoleonic Wars, Scott's favourite was without doubt the Duke of Wellington. He admired Napoleon, but did not like what he had read about him as a person, and Scott needed historical characters on whom he could sincerely lavish praise. By the time Scott had returned from Paris, the young Davidov, I'll put him on now, the young Davidov had time to digest the descriptions and the sense of shock in Russia caused by the December's attempted coup. His reaction, as will become apparent, was not perhaps that what Scott would have expected. The young man had been given a privileged view of manners and mores of enlightened society in Scotland. He had attended numerous dinner parties and other gatherings, and even visited the Sheriff Court in Selkirk, as a visitor, of course. A quote from Scott's journal would be apposite at this juncture. Young Mr. Davidov entered upon the cause of the late discontents in Russia, which he imputes to a deep-seated Jacobin conspiracy to overthrow the state and empire. and establish a government by consensus. There was much truth in what the young Russian said, but the tone of the response would indicate that he was firmly on this side of the despotic Tsar Nicholas I and the status quo. When Vladimir Davidov had finished his studies in Edinburgh, he announced his departure from Scotland for London. In the journal, Scott writes, "I am somewhat sorry to see for my young friend his friends permit him to be so long in Britain, to be happy in Russia. Yet this is a prejudice of those who suppose that when the institutions and habits by which they are governed come to be known to strangers, they must become exclusively attached to them. This is not so. The Hottentot returns from civilization to the manners of his crown, and wherefore should not a Russian resume his despotic ideas when restored to his country?" Scott's observation makes no mention of Vladimir Davidov's other uncle, the Decembrist uncle, Vasily Davidov. This omission suggests that the famous liberal Decembrist and the reason for his exile were rarely topics for conversation between Scott and the young man. At their final meeting, Scott was to note in his journal, "I was interrupted for a moment by a visit from the young Davidov, with a present of a steel snuff-box, wrought and lined with gold, and having my arms on the top and down the sides the various scenes from the environs and principal buildings of St. Petersburg. A joli cadeau, and I take that very kind of my own young friend." Scott reciprocated the gesture by sending an engraving of himself by Henry Rayburn to the Black Captain, qualified by a remark that his qualification for fame was so different from that of the recipient. He writes in the journal, "But I am sensible that if there be anything good about my poetry or prose either, it is the hurried frankness of composition, which pleases sailors, soldiers, and young people of bold and active disposition." The exchange of gifts was followed by a letter from Denis Davidov, who was serving in the Russian army in the Russian-Iranian War, 1826-28. From this, Scott writes, "The Russians are certainly losing ground and men in Persia, and will not easily get out of the scrape of having engaged an active enemy in a difficult and unhealthy country. I'm glad of it. It is an overgrown power, and to have them quiet at least is well for the rest of Europe." Prescient remarks in view of what was to come, the Crimean War, and the great game in Central Asia with its threat to British India. Scott's main contacts with Russian had been through the military. Officers such as Matvey Platov, Alexander Yermolov, and Denis Davidov, Black Captain, had all had distinguished military careers and were household names in Russia. But there was one exception. Vladimir Davidov, the young Davidov, who achieved fame by pursuing a diplomatic, if not political, career under the despotic Nicholas I. The Tsar had adopted the motto for his country of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality, a far cry from the French fraternity, égalité, fraternity, liberté. It was a motto that was appropriate for his nickname of the gendarme of Europe, after his promise to put down revolutions in those countries who wished to retain their traditional forms of government. In 1848 has been called the year of revolutions. It was in that year that Scott's old friend, Vladimir Petrovich Orlov Davidov, so often described as the younger Davidov, was appointed Minister of the Interior of Tsarist Russia. Scott may not have met many Russians, but those with whom he did meet were important people in the history of Russia and well acquainted to give him some understanding of Russia and leave him with many impressions of a country which for many, and possibly for himself, remained an enigma. Thank you.
thanks, Dermot. Do stay there. It was, as usual, a beautifully composed piece, and there was a thread in it. I knew various things that you were threading together, but I've never seen them threaded together in totality, so it was very interesting to me in that respect. Surely you'll take some questions.
Of course, I'll try. I do. Yes, Eric.
Dairmid, I'm not here to plague you, but anyway, all I would say is that you've got every book reference from the back of the journal, Anderson's journal, which is wonderfully read. The nice bit about Walter Scott was he had that sort of sensibility to wonder, to think culturally how a young man from a completely other culture is coming into a so-called liberal, albeit conservative British, but that it may be the young Davidov did take some beneficial ideas back from Scotland. But the other nice thing I would like to say is there's a certain textbook which I do believe the military got after 1944. It's a wee poetry booklet called by Yanko Lavrin. Yes. And it's got classical, as we say, called classical samples of Russian poetry, because it was thought that the military ought to know the cultural background before communism for people that would be attached to military attaches liaison with the Soviets. And in fact, there's lots of Pushkin, Dzержavin in it as well. But there's also a wonderful poem by the uncle, Denis Davidov, which is in a Hazarsky sort of bazaar. They believed that they played greatly around with these things, and they were in camp and they were by Mount Pindar. Maybe at another meeting. I had a go at this 30 years ago, but it's Davidov's got this other wonderful book called Diary of a Partisan. I've got that at home, and it's I've not read much into it.
Yes, I think what is really very interesting, you have in the one family, a very distinguished Russian family.
Absolutely.
You've got one gentleman who took part in the coup d'etat and asked for himself and had banished to Siberia, and the other one who became a folk hero. In fact, Denis Davidov was buried in Novi Devichi, that's where he's buried, a place in Russia reserved for heroes or well-known people. But the other one, he's well read, his brother, his cousin, I should say, his cousin is well read, because he did a lot of good work in establishing schools, not just for exiled Russians, but for the indigenous peoples.
Here's one for that. Just as I was mentioning that Tsars having come to Scotland, the people want to know Trinity House, the old customs house of Leith, very maritime. Got a visit one day from, was it Nicholas? And so the Scotch connection with Leith and the Baltic and Scotland.
And Moffat as well. I mean, went down to Moffat as well. I mean, they haven't got over it in Moffat yet. But he did visit Moffat, yes. But I only mentioned the context of, I don't think people realise, because it's one big step away from the throne. I mean, Constantine should have become the Tsar, but he didn't, and so, sir.
Yeah, I was wondering that. I suspect that perhaps the answer is you don't, but as a long shot, do you know anything about the Battle of Causeway Side?
I don't.
I ask as a resident.
You live there, do you?
Well, just near it.
That's very interesting. I was really searching for why there was a riot. It may have been lack of food or loss of jobs in that area. There were sort of food riots at that time. But don't forget the blockade was on, for a long time. It must have, apart from the gentlemen in a club like this, be missing their claret. But that's a different thing. But it's a very good question. I really can't answer, and I've looked everywhere to. Maybe is there a plaque or anything there?
Well, presumably it's not to do with the attitude of the traffic wardens. No, there's not a plaque.
No.
I must say that I've never heard of the Battle before, but obviously it's something that is incumbent upon nearby residents.
I think, Scott didn't like it. The army doesn't like aiding civil power, because they're against their own people. It's not very pleasant. And Scott did actually mention one incident, and I think it was that one rather than the other one I mentioned, Morden Hill. but he had a swipe at someone with his sabre and went back to apologise almost.
We're starting to run late, but I can't resist just mentioning one thing. It's about Russian ladies pursuing Scott. Would give
I
one.
mentioned, yeah.
Yeah, when Scott was in Naples trying to recover, he was approached by a Russian countess. In English, it's Wolkonsky, Countess Wolkonsky.
Wolkonsky is a good name, actually, good name.
And she asked him to write a poem. And there are 3 versions of it in manuscript, and in this edition of Scott's shorter poetry, it's the last one. It's the last
That's very
poem.
interesting.
And I'd love to send you that. And the notes.
Please do, because I left it. I thought you'd never get out of water. We went to these dinners,
Yes.
and Anne told him not to drink, but he did.
Yeah.
And didn't lengthen his life at all. And then you say, well, you drifted back by Naples, you're quite right.
Yes. Yeah.
I've been into. Oh, these Russian ladies are around.
Yes,
Yeah.
very fashionable as well. Yes. Well, thank you. I just make a few last announcements. If
Please,
I could just hug the limelight yet again.
Yes.
One last time. I mentioned our next talk, which is next meeting, which is Professor Thomas Richardson, 20th of June, on Scott and John Gibson Lockhart. There's one special thing I'd like to mention. Lee has very kindly brought some items about the club's history, because we're coming up to the 125th anniversary, and on that table are the old minute books of the Society for people to look at, and other items. And on the table outside, where the canopies are going to shortly to be served, and people can go out and have them, there are some items that you can take away if you like. The volume of past presidential addresses called Talking About Scott, and also some old printed bulletins of the Society. So they're there for you if you want to take one or more of them away. And all that remains now is to call upon my predecessor, not my successor, as chairman, and that's Alistair Hutton, to give the vote of thanks.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think tonight we have all benefited greatly from the fruits of Diarmid's affection for Russia, as he's unwrapped for us Sir Walter's impressions of that vast country and of its people in particular. You've given us an admirable tour de table of European history and the rise and fall of the French dictator, which really opened the door for Scott to meet new Russian writers, appreciate their work, as well as making the acquaintance of Russian officers and aristocrats. I was fascinated by the links between Edinburgh and Russia, and sorry to learn that Scott hadn't been able to penetrate the meat of some of the Russian military stories, which I'm sure he would have found to his taste. He must have been amused by the ball given by Princess Galitzina by comparison with his own ball given for George IV. Diarmid, once again, you've thrown open a new door on Sir Walter Scott for us, for which we thank you very much indeed.